Recording. Okay. Thank you for coming today. Mike Piera from Analog Man Guitar Effects up in Bethel, Connecticut, up Route 7. And next to me is my assistant, Matt Ray, who, as I mentioned before, grew up in Canaan, and he's one of the most fantastic telly players around. He's got a band, Matt Ray Band, I guess.
Matt Ray Trio.
Matt Ray Trio. Plays around a lot. Opens up for some really great players like Sonny Landreth. And, it's really helping me. I play guitar, but not like Matt. So, let me see what we're going to cover today. Are you people more interested in the technical? Who here is more interested in like the technical part of pedals? Not really. Business? People want to know about starting a business. You mentioned that. Not really. Okay, more about just the general use of pedals and music.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know. I just want to I don't want, and also I want to make sure that anybody with a question at any time, just yell out, hello, or excuse me, or raise your hand or something, because I want to take a lot of questions and answers, because that's the best way to really get the information that you guys want to hear. And sometimes I'll talk about something, that brings up more questions, so we'll do that. So basically, I started out as a software engineer. Now I'm Analog Man. You figured it out. But I started out as a software engineer, and I traveled to Japan a lot back in the mid-'80s. And when I was in Japan, I had a lot of free time, so I walked around, and they had a lot of great vintage guitar shops back then. They really appreciated the fine vintage guitars like the 59 West Pauls, which this is a reissue of.
Mike.
Thank you. It's a reissue, but it's still several $1,000s, so I have to be careful. But it's not 100,000 or 200,000. And so I learned about the vintage guitars over there and saw how much money they were going for. So I started buying up here before they were popular here. And I'd bring them to Japan, sell them over there, and made a lot of money that way. Finally, it caught on in this country. And so I started looking for the vintage pedals, the old fuzz spaces that Jimi Hendrix used, the Univibes, tube screamers, and I'd bring them over. Then that caught on here, so those became hard to find. And I figured, well, why don't we just build the pedals? And I realized, it wasn't quite that easy, especially back when I started, there was no internet. Everything was very different then. We had to actually reverse engineer the pedals, and finding parts back then, there was no Google. You had to go to all of your local electronic shops and try to find these parts, and half the time you didn't even know what the parts were. But little by little I learned there was a core of people around the country that were into making the pedals back then. And we would get together and talk on the phone, and these transistors are really good, Mike, check these out. And that's kind of how we got started. Back then, when I started making pedals like our chorus pedal, you couldn't even buy these switches that we used to turn the pedals on and off. These are called the true bypass switches. Nobody really made them. Finally, Mike Fuller from Fulltone, he was one of the first boutique guys. He made his own pedal, which the Chinese then copied his switch, and now we're able to all buy the switches easily. But even things as simple as a switch were very hard to find back then. Nowadays, with the internet, if you just go on there, you can find everything you need, even kits to put them together, or some places will sell you a little circuit board, and then you can find the parts. There's a place called Smolder Electronics out in Brooklyn, and pretty much, actually I get a lot of my parts from him too, because I've known him for 15 years, and a lot of the parts we get from him are just fantastic for making pedals, so it's a lot easier now. So a lot of people are getting into business. I think every week there's probably 10 new guitar effects companies. It's echoing what I'm saying. The camera. Okay. So that's kind of how I got my start. And then when the internet came about, so being a software engineer, I was there when the internet started, and even before there was internet, there was email, and there was something called news groups. And I remember Usenet news groups. There was all that guitar effects news group, and we would go on there and discuss all the vintage pedals, and then there was like kind of the DIY thing started, and people started talking about how to make these pedals. And then when the website started, I was able to use text editors, since being a software engineer, just make my own website from scratch. And I actually have an example of it over here. Let's get this out of the way. And unfortunately, my main website, analogman.com, has not really changed since the start of the internet. It's quite vintage, but my reading glasses. Oh, there, index. So you know, text, some links. This is before I had analogman.com. Actually, we put our websites on AOL.com, or there was a bunch of other places you could post websites. There's a picture there of me and Adam at Rock from the Beastie Boys, which you can't see. And yeah, talking about Usenet. Guitar shows. We used to do a lot of guitar shows back in the day. My first guitar show was in 1993 in Long Island, and I brought a bunch of vintage guitars to sell and a bunch of vintage guitars to sell. And that got really popular for a while until the internet came out, and then it was a lot easier to buy things online than at the guitar shows. But I had a lot of great time at the guitar shows. A lot of great players would show up, and it was a lot of fun. Zvex, I actually sold Zvex's back, this was about 15 years ago, and he had 6 pedals now. He's got about 600 now. A few other pedals I sold. I was selling some guitars, parts, and then all the pedals I sold were pretty much vintage pedals, old Electromonics, MXR, Maestros. A lot of these pedals are very expensive now. I don't know if I can see them, but Color Sound was being reissued. They stopped. Now these Color Sound reissues are now considered vintage. That's how old this website is. So let's go back.
So Mike, for selling pedals, how do you kind of trust someone to give you an honest assessment of the value for vintage pedal?
For vintage pedal, that's tough. But you know, really, an expert like myself or a bunch of other people can look inside it and tell you what's original. I get people every day who send me gut shots at the pedal. This is on eBay. Mike, is this original? I don't mind, you know, telling them to help them out. So that's the best way to do it. But there's also, you know, being Google, you can just Google these things and find gut shots of pedals. And like, for example, I've got some pictures here of some insides of some of my pedals, and you can see what they're supposed to look like, or if they've been changed. So that's a good question. So okay, we're up to the start of the internet. Japan market, right? And actually, when I was in Japan, I was tube screamers were one of the first things we started out. We were the first company that modified pedals. There was a factory pedal made in Japan by Ibanez called the Tube Screamer. They first started out with the TS-808, which Stevie Ray Vaughan used quite a bit. Eric Johnson used them, and they got very popular. And then in the early 80s, they came out with the TS-9, which was still good, but it wasn't quite the same. So we figured out what the differences were. And when I was in Japan, I was able to find that old chip to make the TS-9 into the TS-808. And I went to these little shops by the train station in Japan. Each guy had a little booth with different chips on it. And I just kept looking around. I couldn't speak Japanese that well. I'd show them the part numbers and sell me some. So I started modifying these, and that was on Usenet. And I mentioned it on Usenet, and people just started sending me the pedals and money.
I sent you a tube screamer.
People just started sending me pedals. Like, wow, this is pretty cool. Maybe I should do more of this. So then, of course, a bunch of people saw me doing it and started copying me. So now there's probably a couple dozen people who modify pedals. And then after the tube screamers, I started modifying them. Then Ibanez actually reissued the TS-9, which was the second version, which isn't the one people really wanted. So when the reissues came out, then there was a ton of them for me to modify the old version. So we started doing a lot of those mods. And then finally, Ibanez reissued the original TS-808, which we still modify. We have different mods for them. But then after the Tube Screamer, we started, Nirvana was very popular in the 90s, and they still are. But there was a certain pedal that Kurt Cobain used. You want to play some Nirvana? People want to hear guitar. I've been talking to just play something Nirvana-like. So Kurt Cobain liked to use a chorus pedal. It's called Electromonics go here.
Nirvana?
Yeah.
I don't know anything.
First I'll do it with the chorus off and you hear the difference. That's it. Yeah, that's the out of tune. Yeah, that's what people wanted. So I took the old Electroharmonics small clone pedal, which is the chorus he used, and actually didn't have to reverse engineer it too much because I was able to collect schematics from all these companies that make the pedals. So I found the small clone schematic, but then I also did actually compare it to an old one in my collection. And we started making a chorus pedal, and that was about 15 years ago, and that got very popular. This is a dual version of it, which has got two different speeds. So just like hit a chord, so you can have a nice slow chorus on one side, and the other switch, and you get this nice effect. Fast one or a nice slow one. So we started making the dual chorus.
Mike, the difference between the chorus effect and the Leslie rotating speaker effect.
Well, what a chorus actually is it's a delay, which is a very short delay, and it's blended with your normal signal. And what it does is the delay gets modulated, the speed gets, so the pitch goes up and down, and then it combines the two together, and you get that sound. And one thing it was made to emulate is what you mentioned, the Leslie speaker, which was originally used on the Hammond B3s. It was that big wooden brown thing, and it actually has a spinning. The speaker doesn't actually spin, but there's something above the speaker that spins around and it sends the sound all around. It sounds wonderful. It's just a three-dimensional sound, and this sort of tries to emulate that. And at the high setting, it does a very good emulation. Like, play that clap in there again. And I'll be talking about modulation a little bit later when we get into the different delay types. And then after that, another very popular player who I was lucky enough to start working with probably about 12 years ago is Trey Anastasio from Fish. He would use tube screamers, but he also used something called a Ross compressor. What a compressor does is it tries to keep your level signal even. So if you play really hard, it doesn't get too loud, and if you play really soft, it doesn't get too quiet. And the other thing that the Ross does is it squashes the attack. When you hit the note on your guitar, it's really loud, and this takes the attack away, and it just kind of gives you a nice smooth attack, and it almost swells. It's almost like a violin coming in. You can get a nice violin tone. And we'll show you something. First, we'll play a lick with the compressor off, and then we'll turn it on. So that's your normal sound. You hear a lot of dynamics, which is nice. Off again. So one thing nice it does is it brings up the quiet things, like when you're just touching the strings, little nuances. It brings those up, and it brings the loud things down. And for country playing, which Matt is an excellent country player, it's very popular. All the guys in Nashville, well, not all the guys, but most of the guys in Nashville use my compressor, and because it just does something that sounds great for a clean guitar. Because when you have a really distorted amp, which I'll show you later, the amp does a natural compression. When you hit the strings hard, the tubes can't quite handle it, and they compress your sound. And then as the strings stop vibrating, it brings it back up again. So that's why it's fun to play a distorted amp, because of all the compression. It kind of makes it easier to play. When you're playing clean, a compressor kind of does that. It gives you that kind of natural tube amp compression, but without the distortion. So it's a nice thing to have.
Addictive.
It's addictive.
Don't ever stop using it.
And then we actually, around 10 years ago, we built a second compressor, and we built it into the same box, so it's actually two different pedals in the same box. And this one is based on an old Dan Armstrong orange squeezer, which was a little square box you would stick in your guitar. And it was used by a lot of guys like Steely Dan, Dire Straits. And this one doesn't have as much swell, but it's kind of a cool sound. And you can compare the two. First, do that lick with it off. Yeah, keep it up all the way. You can control the volume. The first compressor. Here's the second compressor. Definitely adds like a little bit of a like professional quality, something you hear. It just makes it a little more interesting.